Hi all, thank you very much for joining us today again. This time we will continue our discussions on culture, economics, and politics. And to do that, we will discuss egalitarianism and inflation. As always, we have James. He is the author of Creating Christ and the Passion of Finance Critics. And for people who are watching this live, please feel free to ask super chat questions. We really want them. I'm even more eager to get super chat questions. Okay, so let's start, James. And the first question that I have for you is, what is the essay about, and what is the context of the essay?
The title is a very revealing essay. At the end of her analysis, she will show that inflation is really a way of bypassing the political problem of raising taxes when government wants to spend and borrow large amounts of money. So for large egalitarian government programs, they really can only be financed in this sort of surreptitious way, inflation, government printing money. And what she's backing up is in 1974, that's the context of this essay, inflation was becoming a massive problem. The slow build of inflation had been a problem, but then after the Arab oil embargo, it just took off incredibly, and Fed policy did not properly react to it. So the 1970s was a period of, by American standards, a period of great inflation, but also a period of declining economic growth. They had to coin a term, stagflation, to explain this recessionary, unprecedented inflation in American history. So that's the historical context in '64 she's writing about, and it's the moral context of the inflation crisis that she's talking about. How it is that government gets away with inflation is in effect a psychoepistemological issue, a shell game, a mental shell game, if you will, with voters. Does that make sense?
Sorry. I think in the context of the essay, one of the things that I find interesting is that the tone is kind of alarming. She doesn't say, well, we're going to have a lot of struggles. She says the US is broke.
Well,
do you think that the US was really on the brink of collapse, or that she was maybe overstating it, or did something happen that the US was able to work on this?
I think that America was heading in a deadly dangerous direction. Inflation was not improving. The stagflation was not improving, even by the late '70s. In 1976, a Democrat was elected president, and things were not getting any better under him. He was the one, though, before he ended his administration, appointed a different kind of Fed chairman, a Fed chairman who aggressively fought inflation. Now, there's no ideal Fed policy. There's no rational Fed policy. But he came in and slammed the brakes on monetary expansion and credit expansion. Interest rates went way up. For a while, they were 18% on some consumer interest rates in this country, 20%. So they went really, really high. It caused an economic contraction in the early 1980s. But what it did do is reverse the inflation effect that was eating away at the American economy. Had inflation not been addressed in some way, America was headed for perhaps a hyperinflationary crisis like the Weimar Republic or a Latin American country.
Thank you. So let's start at the beginning.
Yeah.
And why does Rand think that intellectuals are being responsible? Actually, she compares them to Nero. Why does she think about that?
Well, these sort of and the way they discuss both their egalitarian social policies and their strategies for achieving these are as reckless as Nero, the ultimate symbol of public policy irresponsibility. You've got the emperor fiddling, according to legend, as singing as his capital is burning to the ground, basically. And that was what was going. She perceived in the 1970s that Rome was burning, in effect, if you will. Inflation was starting to get out of hand. America was in an economic crisis. and it was a perceived economic crisis. As serious, I mean, Ayn Rand was by no means alone in the mid 1970s in seeing America in a terrible crisis. The whip inflation now buttons that Gerald Ford, the president in '76, had, that I don't know what effect they had on inflation or could have, but it was perceived as a real economic crisis, and Rome was burning. And we had to do something about this stagflation, or we were in trouble. The responses by intellectuals were actually the cause of the problem in the first place. She starts out with her, one thing I do want to say, in the beginning, she dismisses egalitarianism. And I agree with her. Back in the 70s, most Americans, right or left, rejected outright egalitarianism, equality of outcome. Everyone should be the same. Unfortunately, in the past 50 years, that has seriously declined in the United States. In many quarters, egalitarianism is now assumed as the correct moral approach. Ayn Rand dismissed it as the obscene immorality that it was. You mean that people who work less are going to get paid just as much as people who work harder and better? That creative thought will not be rewarded, that the best and most skilled technicians, the good people, the better people, the key people, actually aren't being rewarded for their importance in the production process. So egalitarianism she regarded as an example of moral inversion, total moral inversion, the punishment of the good at the expense of the bad. And so she dismissed it morally, and she had a good point. She'd written Atlas Shrugged, which, to my satisfaction, thoroughly refutes the idea and demonstrates the role of the individual mind in human survival. But I think that today, why should we have billionaires? We're told today. Why should there even be such income inequality? As if wealth inequality or income inequality is itself an injustice. Well, of course, inequality is justice. In reality, people are not the same. Some people do work harder. Some people are more creative in their thought. Some people do deserve much higher incomes in comparison to others. Unfortunately today, egalitarianism is much more widely accepted and as morally obscene as it is.
And before discussing the whole issue of inflation, she also plugs another set of society, which is revealed in the aftermath of Allende's government. Could you discuss a bit more about the kind of mentality that she's describing, and why is it consequential to talk about both them and the intellectuals?
The one point that she makes here, I think, that is key to the very question you're saying, is her point about egalitarians and their mentality. They are denying the existence of something. What I just said, achievement, ability, the differences between people, the moral differences, and the practical outcome of those differences, and the practical outcome of incentivizing incompetence versus hard work and creative thought. She's saying they don't. What a great example! The couple of presidents ago, Barack Obama, when he was talking about small businesses, he had the temerity, he had the gall to say, "You small business owner, you didn't build that. You didn't build that." What a classic example of outright denial. Now, I don't believe Barack Obama believes that small businessmen don't contribute. He said, well, you got the roads, you got the police, the government makes it all possible. You didn't build that on your own. Well, look, everybody gets the roads. Everybody gets the same police. That business and its success is the result of those business owners and those individuals and their work. They did build exactly that. So this denial, this mental denial of achievement, this mental denial of competence, this mental denial that some people do deserve much bigger incomes than other people, is what they're in denial about. So they're pretending a primary fact of existence available to everyone's eyes is not in existence. Humans are capable of that kind of self-delusion, and it's that kind of self-delusion that creates a cloud around the entire issue, right? So yeah, when you deny a basic fact that underlies this, you're going to miss it. And here it's connected very much to her analysis of inflation and the role of the producer versus the consumer. When you deny the role of the producer, which is in effect what inflation also does, you're also in a sort of mental denial about the differences between people's productive capacities and what the proper outcomes should be from that.
Just let me say hi to Marvin, who is making a super chat. I actually discussed this essay with Marvin last weekend. So
hey, Marvin.
Hi, Marvin. So, and another setting factor, she actually, it's very interesting. She talks about three different types of people in society in this essay. She talks about the intellectuals. She talks about the anti-conceptual mentality people who just, they are smoking right across this extremely flammable place.
The Chilean factory. There's a Dow chemical factory in Chile. Right? It had been taken over by one authoritarian government. There's a junta, another government's coming in. And when they come in, they re-invite, of course, the sucker American big businessmen mostly all line up to be suckers after their businesses had been nationalized and taken over by the government. They're willing to come back in under the same contractual terms. But when the American technicians got there, they were horrified. They saw that there were people smoking and, around dangerous fumes. They saw that things were corroding. They saw that upkeep had gone down, standards had gone down, the fire sprinklers were out of order. You could imagine the disaster they were setting up there with all of that, right? It could have been horrific at a Dow chemical plant. With the lines were absolutely revealing from the people. We realized that we have to pay people, the key people, the good people, to keep them here, because, of course, egalitarianism makes no distinction between someone who's going to do the job safely and efficiently versus someone who smokes around the dangerous fumes. That's egalitarianism in action.
And that brings us to the third kind of people in society that she mentions, and that she thinks that they aren't mentioned as such in any place, and that's the people of the brain, the people of the mind.
We're pretending they don't exist.
Exactly.
If we were to acknowledge the mind, if we were to acknowledge individual differences of thought, creativity, effort, then we would suddenly have the factual basis to know that, yeah, there are more important people here that should be paid more. They are contributing far more to the productivity and the safety of what we're doing.
And I think it's one of the brilliance of this essay. She's able to bring all these three factors together in this statement when she says that, well, these people think that they will rely on these other people, and these other people think we'll get a loan from the IMF, but nobody counts that the US, which is the country that is pulling all these funds, is broken in itself.
See, that's the thing. There are limits, and America was going to come to limits, and she could foresee. Ayn Rand was not a range-of-the-moment thinker. She would see the long-term, the very thing that they are ignoring, the long-term impacts of their policies. You may not feel it this year or next year, but 10 years, 20 years, what's going to happen down the line with this policy? There must come a point, a breaking point, where finally even the productive parts of the world economy, even the American producer, is going to say, sorry, all out. We can't keep funding the party.
And this brings us to inflation. And I think this is from all the essay, I think this is the most salient part, because for me, I studied economics, and this is something way much different from what I had been taught. For instance, I studied in a Chicago school-based kind of school, and they aren't very sure about what is the role of inflation and how it translates. Basically, the main models, the main thinking is that, well, basically there's a thing called money, and this thing called money is the thing that sets the prices. And if there is more money, then the prices go up just like liquid, and nobody gets hurt. And that is such a silly view, according to this.
No, it really is, because it believes that a promise is as good as a commodity. It believes that whether it's government or anyone else's simple say so. She gives the great example of the private counterfeiter, right? Who's really just passing pieces of paper that people are accepting as promissory notes. They all come back to him and say, well, but you see, everything that makes private counterfeiting theft makes government printing of money theft. Everything that makes counterfeiting on a private scale distorting of the economy on a much grander scale makes it distorting of the economy when the government prints money. Your Chicago school, Milton Friedman and his friends, they believed that there was a correct kind of Fed policy, that sort of they could fine tune the economy through a manipulation of the money supply and credit availability, and they could do it, they could manage it, they could finesse it and get the exact right amount. But of course you can't. You can't. The Austrians have a key insight here. There is no supercomputer, no row of supercomputers that can do the calculation that the free market price system can do. And that especially pertains to credit and money, as Mises himself demonstrated. The interest rate itself is one of the key prices in the economy, and it is governed by the same principles. And the idea that money has to be a commodity, it's real straightforward as far as I'm concerned. The only real kind of money is the kind of money that can end a debt, that can finalize a debt, not just a promise for another promise for another promise for another. That may be currency of some kind, but to really cancel a debt out that I have for goods, and this is so wonderful that the way Ayn Rand describes it, every time someone loans money, what they're doing is they're loaning you their unconsumed production. That's it. Without excess production, there is nothing to save, nothing to invest, nothing that goes into increasing future productivity. In the meantime, you have to eat your seed corn, the very thing that generates new investment and productivity in the future. Now, obviously, that's a total blindness to what we really need in the long term. So it was as an economist, I have to ask you, it has been a while since I read this essay, but I was once more dazzled with Ayn Rand's understanding of economics, the clarity of her simple explanation of savings and credit, of simple Robinson Crusoe type examples. She builds up an understanding of why division of labor is important, what production really is, and with it she shows that it's really not that we're told every day it's the consumer who drives the American economy. Consumer, as if all you need is more mouths. Mouths are the thing that no. Insofar as a consumer is not also a producer, he is a parasite. Now, of course, I can voluntarily help my family and friends and stuff, but how many extra mouths is the producer supposed to feed? And that's exactly the critical weakness of government inflation policy. You see, at some point, we reach the straw that breaks the camel's back.
I think there are several things that surprise me from the way that she interprets this. And to mention maybe the most important one, comparing her to, I think, probably all economists in the world, is that she starts from the perceptually available data. She doesn't start like Keynes, like, well, there's consumption and then there's government expenditure. She doesn't start with the abstractions and then tries to say, okay, well, let's sort that out, whatever, in whichever way we can. She really starts from the beginning, and that's why she's able to grasp how silly this thing is.
Yeah.
And maybe just as a footnote, the classics used to be a bit wary and of this kind of inflationary issues. They were never really good on monetary issues, partly because they hadn't discovered the marginal consumption or all the marginality issues, and many of the things Keynes was able to grab them just to smash classical theory altogether.
Oh, wow. See, you provide the insight of a real economist here. And as I understand it, that's exactly true. It's the marginal revolution that really created a, I don't want to diss the classical economists because, of course, Adam Smith, Say, Ricardo, they had really important and profound sort of macro insights into how the economy works. But of course, it was not nearly so sophisticated science as that economics was until people like the Austrians came along and gave us the marginal revolution and understood that economics was something at the margin. And of course, Mises came along and applied marginal analysis to money and credit itself in his monumental theory of money and credit. Ayn Rand was familiar with Mises's work. She'd read several of his books. She knew him personally. The very famous economics writer Henry Hazlitt, who wrote most of the economics editorials for the New York Times for about 10 years, introduced Ayn Rand to Ludwig von Mises, and they actually knew each other. Ayn Rand read Hazlitt's books. As a child, she had Marxist propaganda pounded into her, but she was also familiar with Keynesian economics. So she was economically literate. In other words, she did know her economics. And you're absolutely right. She has a stunning analysis, even in some ways more clear than Henry Hazlitt, who was a dazzlingly clear economics writer. His book, Economics in One Lesson, is like a standard for clarity in economics writing. But Ayn Rand at least matches that level of clarity here and adds her own dimension, as you say. It's inductive. She draws it down to the concrete level where you really can't refute it, and she gives it the moral dimension. In one of her last speeches that she ever gave, Sanction of the Victims, she was asked in the question period, I think it was the last public speech she ever gave. In the question period, someone asked her, what's the moral justification for a gold standard? And she had a very simple answer, which is the summary here of what she said here. So that there is no way for the looters to get their hands on your money. Inflation is in effect a way of stealing from savers at the expense of borrowers.
And
she understood that at that clarity of a level.
And maybe related to the Keynesian issue is that Keynes was really aware of what he wanted to destroy. And he, in the preface of the general theory, he says something like, well, I'm going to destroy essentially the issue of Say's law. And basically Say's law says that you cannot consume more than when you produce.
But A is not A.
Exactly. But I mean, but what Keynes does is he rewrites the law, saying something like,
savings isn't the source of future productivity, it's a leakage.
Exactly.
Right? Keynesians despise savings, and they emphasize the role of the consumer. Demand, demand, demand. But as Ayn Rand points out, demand and supply are really ultimately two ways of looking at the same thing. If there is no production, there is no consumption. A beautiful way she has of putting it in Aristotelian terms. Consumption is the final cause of economic activity. The efficient cause of economic activity is production. And the only really honest trade is between producer and producer.
Could we talk a bit more about what does it mean specifically, this idea of inflation is hidden under perceptual illusions created by conceptual links?
Well, in a very complex economy, it's very easy to lose sight of what is really causally important, what is really going on. And in order to see long-term effects, in order to see a 10 or 20-year problem down the road because of what you're doing now, you have to think conceptually. You can't be a concrete bound mentality. You have to actually rise up and see what's going on a conceptual and principled level. And you just went through a great example of how the most famous and influential economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, actually was a mental fog, a reversal of the correct understanding in many basic issues of economics, starting with his fundamental understanding of demand and the role of the consumer and the role of savings and investment. So rather than clearing this up, he increased the confusion so that people think, for example, as Ayn Rand says in this article, it's really the speed with which money flows through the economy. It's really just having a market and mouths to feed out there, to consumers out there that are hungry. That's all that we really need. And of course, that blinds us to the role of the producer. That blinds us to the role of investment. And so people can be easily misled on this subject, and they are. And they're frequently misled on this subject badly by the intellectuals and the media. Ayn Rand does not blame, even the savage hordes who are taking over the Dow chemical plant in Chile. She doesn't blame the average person who's just a victim of the intellectuals and the media spreading the intellectuals' ideas. They have pounded into their heads that, yeah, really, I'm doing the vital thing in the economy by consuming. Production really plays no role. And productivity need not be worried about.
And actually, one of the interesting parts of the last 50 years is that Keynesianism as such had been retracted. It had been taken up by something a bit less crazy, which were like what they call the neoclassical, the neoclassical consensus.
Yeah.
But the last 10, 15 years, since the financial crisis, what we have seen is both a return of Keynesianism, and now there's this push of modern monetary theory. And I think she has one of the greatest refutations of that, saying like, she called something like, why, like, for instance, the MMT, modern monetary theory, said something like, we have factories not working on the streets, so we should print money and put those factories into work. But they don't ask themselves, why are those factories not running out?
Exactly.
And that's a great question that only a mind like Ayn would say. Or I mean, many.
Right. Exactly. Well, you see, they've blinded themselves on purpose. And here it's a psychoepistemological and moral issue, as we said in the beginning. It's really not just if it were just an economics issue, you and I both know enough economics to know that we'd win, right? It's just reality. And history shows it. I mean, how many examples do we have to have? Those indices of economic freedom show every single year that the freer the economy, the better off the people are, the better the economy. So history is clear empirically about this. The economics really is rooted, I think the bad economics is rooted in bad psychoepistemology and bad ethics. They are trying to pretend producers don't exist because they have to deny his moral role. And that's because they start at it with egalitarian roots. If it weren't for his egalitarian motives, Keynes would not have engaged in this obfuscation of the role of the consumer or savings in the economy. And of course, policymakers in the 21st century want to spend like drunken sailors. And so, of course, they're returning to things like Keynesianism and trying to find new monetary theories to justify ridiculously loose monetary policies. Yeah, they want to spend money. And that's the ultimate motive. And as she points out, the recipients, welfare recipients and the poor are really just window dressing. They're just the excuse for them to take control of the money system. It's really seeking power. But their ethics is we have to deny the producer and his moral role.
Exactly. That was going to be my next question. Like they want this new world they want throw some crumbs to the welfare recipients, but then they want to maintain this bureaucracy and break some of the producers into welfare.
one of the things that was just, it was absolutely shows you the mentality of some of these people. The New York Times article that she cites, the guy was saying, well, what other rights could be on the horizon? You know, we have a right to education and medical care and housing and Lord knows what all. We have the right to, he says, you know, what if we talk about the right to orgasm, the right to be believed to be beautiful? What? What? These people live in an alternate reality. They really do, where the government could somehow provide people the right to sexual satisfaction, or, you know, thinking they're good looking, to convincing me that I'm good looking or something, as if that would be good for the economy. That's the kind of level of detachment from reality some of these egalitarians have. And that's the kind of blindness that it induces.
Actually, I was going to ask you this later, but now that you have mentioned, the guy from this magazine is talking about expanding citizenship like crazy. Wasn't that one of the issues that collapsed the economy of Rome, if I understand correctly?
Rome ran a welfare state. You know, it was really funny. Right on in 1974, we were just getting out of the Vietnam War, hugely expensive. The previous president, Johnson, had given America Medicare for the first time, you know, a national medical program to take care of all old and retired people. So he declared war on poverty. So there were huge federal programs now addressed for poverty. These spending programs. Well, the Roman state was similarly engaged in expensive warfare and a welfare state. So the government was in order to get slaves and new territories, conquests, where the Roman government got its money, it would engage in warfare. And at home, it would appease the citizens with bread and circuses, famously. They would literally distribute food, grain, oil, bread, fish to the public. They would give them food, welfare in effect, right? And they would provide them public entertainment, public spectacle. Healthcare wasn't a right then, but there were these expensive government programs. In order to finance this, what did the Roman Empire do? It started debasing its currency. It started, corrupting the silver coins and shaving off the gold of the gold coins. It literally did. It started expanding the money supply, shaving off currency. Inflation became a significant problem. The economy began to be eaten out. Now, there were lots of other reasons that brought down the Roman Empire, but there's no doubt that Rome's economy, in the beginning, Rome had great success by creating a large, peaceful area for international trade. It sort of created the Mediterranean, a free trade zone, if you will, a relatively free trade zone of peace in the Mediterranean. This dramatically augmented their prosperity. So at first, Rome had a golden age, if you will, in which they could fund large public building projects and so forth. But of course, in time, the party runs out when you start debasing your currency to finance large government expenditures.
Thank you. So Marvin has a question, but first, I would like to ask you about one interesting thing that I couldn't completely get. Does she make a distinction between a proper and quote stolen concept view of credit? That there is a proper way in which one can think about borrowing things, but the government view of I give you a paper and then you give me a good, that is improper way.
Nobody would ever think that someone who got a loan and then just got another loan to pay that loan and then just got another loan to pay that loan in this chain reaction of loans was doing anything for the economy, being a producer, or even being an honest participant. At some point, his scheme will probably run out of gas and he'll be caught, right? But yet that is exactly the policy that the government takes and assumes they can take forever. We can have this ongoing debt upon debt upon debt in the United States. It's absolutely frightening what Congress is considering now. $3.5 trillion in additional spending. And they talk about blindness. They have the nerve to gaslight the American people and say that it's all paid for. There won't be any increase in taxes or inflation or debt as a result of spending trillions and trillions of dollars more over the next few years. That is departure from reality on a vast scale, isn't it?
It's crazy. So Marvin's question is, has there been inflation without prior deficits? Isn't the essential problem that deficits and inflation are just a mechanism for financing unsustainable debt?
The reason for the monetary manipulation is just that, to make possible and sustain vast spending programs and greater government control. That really is the ultimate goal, I would say, of monetary manipulation. Yeah. The only way they can engage in these vast government programs is through debt and inflation spending. I mean, theoretically, I sure could see inflation, and whether it causes an immediate increase in the consumer price level, the consumer price index, say, or the producer price index, it will still, as Ayn Rand explains, have the effect of eating your seed corn. You're going to be going into already saved up wealth, and you're going to start eating your savings. You're going to start eating your all the way to your seed corn, reducing future productivity. That is the inevitable course of it. So rather than seeing that that would obviously be the inevitable course of it, we've induced this blindness about it. So theoretically, could I imagine there being monetary inflation without big government debt? Theoretically, yeah. But the motive, historically, has always been, whether it's ancient Rome or the United States today, with its big deficit spending, to spend. Yeah.
And well, I mean, I think Marvin is referring something like high inflation or hyperinflation, and they're usually linked to either governments collapsing or sovereign defaults, or people thinking that there is going to be a default.
Well,
for instance,
at some point with inflation, there's a crisis in confidence in the government itself, and of course, that's the end of the road. Even the private con man who can't get away with it forever, there's the government con man sometimes can't get away with it forever. And once there is that crisis in confidence, you have exactly what happened in the Weimar Republic, don't you?
Yeah. Or Venezuela. So one of the most chilling parts of the essay is the statement that if the goods go, government will go authoritarian. Could you talk a bit more about that? And
say that again? Not quite sure I understood.
Sorry, like she says, well, yes, they will be able to take the goods, but they will try to keep you producing the goods. They will be more explicit in their means.
Oh, there comes a point when the party is over, and boy, what a sent a chill up my spine when I read it. There comes a point, she says, when of course the party is over, and you're going to realize that the government's only capital was you. You know, at the end of the day, you are their capital. Ultimately, you are their slave. And so it must be at the end of the day, right? If your government's going to maintain control, then it's just outright. You may as well be in a totalitarian, right? Because that's the road it leads to. If you don't get off that terrible cycle, it will eventually lead to, the necessity of government logic there. This crisis requires more government, more government, more government. When that crisis finally hits, total government must be the answer. Unless you question the whole premise from the beginning, that this thing was just a shell game, a pyramid scheme, a way of stealing from savers to at the expense of borrowers. Until you recognize that inflation ignores the role of production, the producer, and productivity. No, and get off that terrible cycle. The problem cannot be fixed.
And she also makes a prediction, which thankfully didn't come true, about the Civil War. Could you?
Well, looking at today, it's true. Let me put it this way. The near-term crisis she was talking about did not result in a civil war. Fed policy got, we don't want to call it more rational, but at least fought inflation. And we avoided a crisis. To a large extent, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher helped improve the economics to some marginal degree in Great Britain and the United States. And so we avoided a crisis. There was actually a renewal of economic activity, and of course, the advent of computer innovation, including the internet, dramatically increased productivity in the economy. So we were able to avoid, at least in the near term, an economic caused civil war that Ayn Rand so feared. But here we are in the 21st century, and violence and partisanship is increasing, even in the United States, in a dramatic way. And a fear of a civil war as a result of the same forces that she was talking about almost 50 years ago now are at play here, and again are threatening civil disruption in the United States. Yeah.
But if there is a civil war happening in the US, wouldn't it have different root causes? And without, I mean, she thinks that the clash in this essay, I understand that the clash would come between the people and the intellectuals primarily. Would this have a different root cause?
Unfortunately, America isn't the same America that it was in 1974. Ayn Rand had a certain confidence, and I think American attitudes were different then about production and egalitarianism. And I think those have declined as well. So actually, the risk of a civil war or some violent conflict between the two sides is increased in my mind, because I don't think back in her day the intellectuals would have stood a chance. The ordinary guy would have outvoted the worst of the intellectuals' proposals, and often did. Nixon won in a landslide against socialist McGovern. Reagan defeated Carter, right? And so that's the thing. There is a democratic limit here that these people want to get around for their statist activities. But America has declined. And if anything, there are people now, large numbers of people on both sides, so that it is even scarier to me as a prospect, frankly.
Sadly, I agree. But I mean, maybe to end with a more benign note, Rand thinks that something will save the US, right?
She did have confidence in the amazing productive capacity of the American producer. Again, I mean, look at this last year with the COVID lockdowns. Talk about blindness to economic realities, as if you could shut down, in effect, the economy for the better part of a year, and all government needed to do was send out checks to businesses and people. Don't worry, here's your unemployment check. Don't worry, business over here. Here's the check to keep your business alive should you ever want to reopen it. As if that's all they needed to do, was to cut checks to unemployed people and closed businesses, close the economy down for a year, and not have dramatic consequences. I mean, even so dubious an organization as the World Health Organization, last year, the spring of last year, were predicting millions upon millions of people would be thrown into poverty and starvation as a result of the ripple effect of the economic lockdowns in America and Western Europe. Yeah, when the most productive economies in the world are locked down, that is going to have a worldwide effect. I don't know if their estimates are correct. I don't know how big it'll be. But talk about blindness to economic realities, as if you could shut down most of the economy for a year and just send people government checks. Whew. So again, I'm frightened that the Americans are remarkably productive people, and that they do want to work. They do want to sustain themselves, at least many of them. But that has itself declined. That sense of individualism, that sense of personal responsibility, that sense I can do it on my own, has declined and been replaced by a sense of entitlement. I'm owed. I'm a victim. You've screwed me over, so I deserve reparations. That notion has really been setting in the young more and more and more, to my distress.
And sadly, just to like a time machine in the UK, we have again cues on the gas station. Well, here they call it petrol stations. Not because Saudis or anything. It's because people don't want to work. The lorry drivers don't want to work,
Right.
and because of Brexit, we can't hire anymore from the EU. Anyways, I think it's always good to end with good notes. So I don't know if you have something to say about that, James.
Well, one thing that is encouraging is that I think there is a growing awareness of this issue. I think that in subtle and unadmitted ways, people like us are having an impact, at least on some people and in some quarters. And that really is our only hope. We do have a rational philosophy here. We do have the right, and we're right, and we do have the right answers. So when a crisis does come, and when there are serious problems, we should be there with the answers. And if we do, at the end of the day, I think we'll win. Best I can say. Best I can do for you.
Maybe in a couple of generations, but we'll...
Yeah, probably not in my lifetime.
Well, with that being said, I'm out of questions. I thank you and the audience.
Well, thank you, Alejandro. Always great. And thank you for your expertise on economics. Yeah, I'm not the economist.
Sometimes I have that in my soul, but I don't have the space to say that. Thank you for asking that. So with that being said, to the audience, thank you for tuning in. And if you like this kind of discussions, feel free to, if you like these discussions, please support us. Please give us your money. £10 a month is not that much. Now the pound is a little bit weak. So if you're in any other place in the world, please send us your money. And
well, as we said, this is the future of civilization that we're talking about here, and whether the world will continue to increase in prosperity and productivity. That's what's at stake here.
Exactly. And it comes along with perks, right, James?
All kinds. On Saturdays, we do seminars where everyone can participate. We cover Leonard Peikoff courses, that get into objectivism in depth. We've just started a new course, and every Saturday, free to subscribers, you can participate. And that's just one of the perks of contributing to UK Center Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand Center UK. I really want to encourage it. You guys are making a big difference, and you're producing some very good work. Please join us for these discussions. We're going to continue with these essay discussions. We've got all kinds of new programs. Rosie is always working on new ideas, and there's great things on the horizon. So please consider subscribing.
Thank you very much, James. Well, that being said, see you next Tuesday now.
Yes.